visiting our website, which is weareideastudios.com. All right then, let's get back to the video at hand and let's see what Russell Brand has been saying about plant-based meat alternatives.
Being vegan, or at least flexitarian, and having a partly plant-based diet is one of the healthiest things you can do, isn't it? Or all those new meats that are synthetic, disgusting, evil processed things that are going to kill you.
And so straight off the bat, we see the overarching problem in this discussion, which is that because plant-based diets have been touted as healthy, that means that all plant-based foods have to be held to the standard of being objectively healthy. However, that's not the case. And it also removes all nuance from the conversation because, of course, a whole foods plant-based diet is incredibly healthy, but at the same time, there can also be unhealthy plant-based foods as well, which is why when we advocate for a healthy plant-based diet, we advocate for a whole foods plant-based diet. And look, I don't want to misrepresent the arguments that Russell is making in his video, because really the purpose of this video is to highlight the wider discussion around plant-based alternatives and to highlight how they have been hypocritically weaponized to try and present an argument which just doesn't make any sense. That argument being that because some plant-based alternatives aren't healthy, that means that we shouldn't be plant-based. I don't want to linger on this point for too long, but whilst there hasn't been a huge, extensive amount of research comparing processed plant-based alternatives to their meat counterparts, the research that has been done so far shows that if anything, actually these processed meat alternatives are healthier than their meat counterparts, including even for gut microbiome health. And actually, a study that compared Beyond Burgers with red meat burgers found that consuming Beyond Burgers was actually shown to reduce cardiovascular risk factors. In other words, consuming Beyond Burgers over red meat burgers was better for your health. And these weren't just any red meat burgers. These weren't ultra processed bad red meat burgers. These were red meat burgers from a high-end, high-quality butcher shop. So in other words, even the best of the best when it comes to red meat was seen to be worse for you than consuming processed plant-based alternatives. And of course, on top of that, it's worth bearing in mind that processed plant-based alternatives haven't been listed as class 2 carcinogens like red meat has, or indeed class 1 carcinogens like processed meat has. So there's that as well. Plus, that notion of something being processed equaling that thing being bad doesn't necessarily always hold up as being true. Take watermelons, bananas, peaches, and aubergines or eggplants if you're in the US. These foods, as well as many others like them, are very different to the way that they naturally used to be. And the reason they're so different is because we've selectively bred them. And the reason we selectively bred them and changed their genetic characteristics is because doing so actually made them more edible for us as humans. And so making them more edible actually made them healthier and more nutritious for us. So in effect, the processing of these foods actually made them healthier. Now, obviously, processed foods can be incredibly unhealthy for us, and I'm not going to try and argue against that simple and objective fact. But the point of what I'm trying to say now is that it's easy to fall into the trap of believing simplistic and reductive ideas. For example, that processed means bad and unprocessed means good.
But from a health perspective, it seems more important that things are not processed.
Because as a consequence of that logic, we could fall into the trap of saying, well, this processed plant-based food must be bad because it's processed, whereas this unprocessed red meat must be good because it's unprocessed. So ultimately, the question shouldn't be which food is more or less processed, but which food is healthier for us based on its nutritional content and the outcomes that it causes in the body. But to be honest, this is all kind of besides the point, because the purpose of this video is not to try and claim that there are not unhealthy plant-based alternatives. Of course, there are unhealthy plant-based alternatives. So I'm not trying to say that they should be held up as a symbol of health and wellness, but instead what I'm trying to say is they're being held to an unfair and unnecessary standard. And by holding them to this unnecessary standard, we're actually overlooking what veganism is actually about. Firstly, these foods are replicating foods that are already unhealthy for us. Take vegan bacon as an example. Vegan bacon is replicating pig flesh, bacon from a pig, which is literally one of the most unhealthy foods that we can consume. So yes, vegan bacon is healthier than bacon from a pig, but no, it's not objectively healthy. But then why does it need to be? Why does it have to be held to such an unfair and unnecessary standard? After all, if we're choosing to eat vegan bacon, we're not choosing to eat vegan bacon because we think it's the healthiest food that we can consume. The problem is the media and also vegan advocacy groups as well have often touted veganism as something that you do for your health. I think the mentality behind that is that talking about health is an easier entry point into plant-based diets than talking about the morality of what we do to animals. But by making veganism about health, it means that when plant-based food companies release food items that aren't objectively healthy, they open themselves up to criticisms because the credentials of these food items are based on the healthfulness of these food items, when actually it would be much more pertinent and effective to make the credentials of these food items around the morality of these food items. You see, when veganism is framed correctly as a movement that is trying to reduce the exploitation, harm, and death of animals, it becomes obvious that it doesn't matter if these plant-based alternatives aren't as healthy as, say, a kale smoothie or a chickpea salad, because the point of these alternatives is to not replicate the healthfulness of whole plant foods, it's to replicate the taste and texture of their meat counterparts. And the reason for replicating the taste and texture of their meat counterparts is so that people no longer perceive meat, dairy, and eggs as being something that they need in their life. By creating plant-based alternatives that tick all of the boxes of what people want from meat, dairy, and eggs, it means that in the future, the meat, dairy, and egg industries will no longer exist. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that these plant-based alternatives shouldn't be healthier than their meat counterparts. Of course, these companies should make their alternatives healthier than what they're replicating, and it certainly seems from the studies that have been done so far that that is the case. But do I eat a Beyond sausage because I think it's the healthiest food that I can consume? Well, no, of course I don't. The reason I consume a Beyond Meat sausage is because I like how a Beyond Meat sausage tastes. If I wanted to consume the healthiest foods I could consume, I would consume a whole plant food instead. So the reason for consuming the Beyond Meat sausage isn't because I believe it to be a staple of a healthy diet. It's because by consuming the Beyond Meat sausage, I'm voting for a world where pigs aren't gassed in gas chambers or have their throats cut in slaughterhouses to create a product that we have an ethical plant-based alternative for. I just find it so hypocritical and obviously contradictory that the meat industry is trying to weaponize the fact that these plant-based alternatives aren't objectively healthy as a reason to therefore not be vegan, because the logic is basically saying, oh hey, you do realize that vegan bacon isn't objectively healthy. I guess that means you should continue consuming bacon from a pig, which is a class 1 carcinogen and involves causing so much suffering and harm to sentient animals. That's fundamentally the logic that they're using, when actually the logic that should be used, and to be fair to Russell, this is the logic that he's using in his video, is hey, these foods aren't the healthiest foods you can consume, so if you're concerned about your health, then maybe choose whole plant foods instead. And this is why brands like VFC are so important, because VFC makes their branding all about the animals. They say that they're an ethical vegan company, and by centering the animals as being front and center in their branding, they're signaling that the reason they exist is to produce a food that in the future will be a part of the reason why chicken farming no longer exists. And I think we need more of that. We need more food brands and food companies and more pioneers in the plant-based food space championing the animal rights aspect of veganism, because that's what veganism is all about. And it lends credibility to the existence of these plant-based alternatives, because fundamentally, that's the reason they exist. To produce delicious alternatives to their meat counterparts, which show people who are interested in veganism but have been hesitant because of taste, texture, and flavor reasons that they no longer need to be hesitant. And by buying plant-based foods, they're not giving up anything except the needless and abhorrent animal suffering that comes with the animal products they currently buy. Ultimately, if we only want to eat healthy foods, that's a totally understandable and amazing thing to do. And of course, we should all make sure that we center our diets around fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, and make those the foundations of our diets. But it's also okay to eat unhealthy foods from time to time as well. So let's bring it back to Russell Brand at the end, because ultimately the arguments that Russell makes in his video are not necessarily the arguments that I've responded to. I've used Russell's video as a mechanism to talk about the meat industry's propaganda. So that brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. And if you're interested in purchasing some Idea Studios clothes, then you can do so at our website, which is weareideastudios.com. All right, guys, thanks again for watching. I really do appreciate it. And I will see you all in the next video.